Welcome and thank you for joining us online. We have a very exciting seminar because this one was meant to happen in June and we've postponed it. So finally, we get our talk. We have Keren MacLennan here from University of Bath, and you are talking about autistic experiences of auditory environments. So welcome and thank you.
Thanks. Great. I will just get my screen shared. Oh, computer's being a bit slow now. Okay.
Cool. That's good. Thank you.
Brilliant. I will just change the view that I can see. Okay, cool. There we go. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm really pleased to come and speak to you all. Just full disclaimer, I am not kind of an auditory specialist. I am very much a sensory experiences kind of researcher. It would be really interesting to kind of hear your perspectives as well on some of the stuff I'm talking about potentially at the end or at any point. I'm also open to people chipping in or asking questions as we go. If you'd like to, I might not be able to see you, but just shout if there are any questions as we go along.
You can also post in the chat as we go along. If anyone's got questions, that might be a good way to do it.
Yeah, great. Anything goes with me. I'm more than happy to have conversations and stuff, so it's all good. But yeah, so I always like to start my talk just by giving a bit of my positionality, just because I think it really underpins. I mean, classically, I'm a bit more of a qualitative researcher nowadays, and we're all about this stuff. But also, I just think it's important just so people kind of know what perspective that I'm coming from in my research, because it really, really underpins kind of what I'm talking about. So my discipline area is all psychology. So again, if I say any terms or things or anything that needs clarity kind of throughout, just give me a shout, because I'm used to talking to a very specific audience. For me personally, I'm a neurodivergent researcher, and I research kind of sensory experiences. So that kind of actual how people are experiencing sensory environments, sensory input is the thing that kind of I'm most interested in, rather than kind of drilling down what's going on mechanistically in the brain and stuff. And kind of as the reason why I talk about that is because I also have sensory processing differences. So a lot of the experiences I talk about in my work, I also experience myself, which I think really informs my interpretations in my research. So I always think it's important for me to say that, as I'm not somebody kind of typically experiencing the sensory world. Or what society deems as typically experiencing. Kind of my perspectives that really underpin kind of what I see autism as, and kind of neurodivergent and neurodiversity as everything I do is from a very neurodiversity kind of perspective. So thinking about how we have kind of socially constructed ideas about what is disordered and what isn't disordered, rather than kind of thinking about it in terms of the fact that people are inherently disordered, if that makes sense. So kind of in opposition to the medical pathology model, and thinking kind of more about people as having differences from a kind of societally constructed view of what is typical, rather than thinking about some people as having deficits and being disordered. And the kind of work I do is all from a perspective of thinking about how we have a real issue, which we do in many fields, but we do in autism research, of epistemic injustice, which for those who maybe aren't familiar with that term, that's thinking about how our research base, our knowledge base, our diagnostic systems, our construction of diagnosis is all built without having any form of autistic input into it, or the autistic kind of perspective or narrative within that. So my kind of research aims to really bring back into the research literature autistic voices and autistic perspectives. And to do that, that really informs my approach. So I do a lot of participatory research. So I ensure that I have autistic people and neurodivergent people involved kind of throughout the process, and not just researchers. I work with a lot of non-researchers who bring lived experience perspectives or organizational perspectives. And yeah, I do X methods, although I definitely nowadays more of a qualitative researcher, given that I care so much about people's own perspectives and stories and narratives. So yeah, so hopefully that helps with the kind of underpinning of what I do. And just as a quick kind of overview of the what I'm kind of focusing on, and I'm going to talk about mainly one study which is most relevant to this group, I think. But my kind of overarching work is looking at how we can make spaces more sensory inclusive, and that is from the experiences of autistic and neurodivergent people. I also do a lot of research into looking at autistic sensory experiences, kind of deep diving into certain elements. For instance, I'm currently setting up a study looking at autistic sensory joy, because I think we don't think about positive experiences enough. And then I really also care about kind of music experiences more specifically, and that's obviously what is quite relevant here. But yeah, these different research areas tend to intersect a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing in my work. And yes, so I thought it would be helpful just to give a little bit of background as to the kind of, from the psychology literature, what I'm talking about. So sensory processing differences, so that's kind of different ways of processing sensory input are experienced by around 94% of autistic individuals. So it's very, very prevalent for autistic people. And as part of that, some of these sensory experiences can be very, very enjoyable, but others can be extremely distressing. And this kind of is across a whole range of different modalities, including light, sounds, touch, sense, and anything else. I've put an example from Emily, who is on Instagram, and the social media is 21 Sensory, of the sound and auditory processing stuff, and she's put things that she likes and dislikes in terms of sounds. And she's one of the collaborators on various projects, not the ones I'm talking about today, but one of them actually. But ultimately, a lot of the negative sensory experiences have consequences for quality of life, as well as mental wellness for autistic people. And we're starting to get some indication that positive experiences might actually be really good for mental well-being. But the research and the kind of looking at positives is with autistic samples is very slim at the moment. And when we're thinking about actual sensory environments, we know that there's a lot of different challenges with certain environments. So for autistic people, we know that the sensory environment in workplaces is a barrier for sustaining employment, which is really important given that autistic people have the highest rate of unemployment out of all disabled groups. And the sensory environment has also been suggested to make it difficult for autistic people to access public spaces. We also, pre-study we did, had just kind of some literary accounts from autistic people describing their experiences of being excluded or feeling uncomfortable in a whole range of different mainstream spaces. And from qualitative research, we saw that autistic people were overwhelmed by and avoid certain public spaces such as large shops, hospitals, cinema. So, and education settings is also other whole area. I'm focusing on adults for in this talk, but yeah, education spaces are also a bit of a sensory nightmare. So based off of that kind of existing work, we really wanted to delve a bit more into understanding autistic people's experiences of public spaces from a sensory focus, because all the other work that had been done prior to this was thinking about but it was like little bits of stuff coming up in the studies that were looking at lots of different things. So we really wanted to understand what public places are either disabling or maybe enabling for autistic people due to the sensory environment. And what about these sensory environments make them disabling or enabling? And what can we do to make places more enabling for autistic people? And this works came out in 2022, which I can't believe, that feels like yesterday, but it was ages ago. So this isn't specifically thinking about auditory spaces, but it obviously included that in a lot of the findings. And what we found, autistic people said that the places that they find to be the most disabling sensory environments are supermarkets, retail shops, and centres, eateries like cafes, restaurants, healthcare settings such as hospitals, doctors' surgeries, high streets and city centres, town centres, and public transport. And this was due to a whole range of different sensory experiences, but kind of the soundscape was a common thing that came up across all of these spaces. I've just noticed the typos as well. And then enabling environments as well, because we want to obviously understand what those look like. So some of the spaces that people talked about enjoying going to a lot more were outdoor spaces was the top, so parks, woodlands, things like that. Stadiums, certain retail shops tended to be smaller ones, more kind of sensory friendly ones, cinemas, theatres, live music venues and clubs, and museums. And you'll note when I talk about my next study that the live music venues one really stood out to me as something that was super interesting. But I'll come back to that. So as part of this, and the reason I'm talking about this work is it kind of really underpins some of the research I'm doing now, which is more focused on kind of music-based stuff, is we kind of developed 6 principles from the data that underpin how disabling or enabling these sensory environments are. And Emily, 21 Sensory, this is what she was involved in and designed this amazing web for us. And we were thinking about kind of how there's this flux between things, these different principles, ranging from kind of the middle, which is environments that might be less challenging, up until environments that might be the most challenging. And so the sensory scape was kind of the first principle, and that was the sensory, what we termed the sensory scape, sensory landscape, and that was the actual sensory environment. Even though we were asking people about their sensory experiences, only one of the 6 principles was really directly, this is to do with the actual sensory input in the environment. So places that were more challenging tended to have a high sensory burden. So that might be, for example, being super loud, or it might be that there's a very complex soundscape, like you might experience in like a shopping centre or something like that, but also thinking about other sensory input. So in there, like bright lights, scents, people bumping into you, stuff like that. But the more challenging places, the sensory input tended to be more sustained and inescapable. So it was there and you couldn't really get away from it, or it wasn't easy to get out of it. And also you had very little control over the sensory input in that environment. And then the next principle was space. So this is places that were more challenging tended to be busier and more crowded, and they also tend to have a confined built environment. So these things interact, as you can imagine, with the sensory factors of the environment. So busy and crowded, obviously if you're feeling overwhelmed and if people are bumping against you, that creates additional sensory challenges. And same with confined built environment, people talked about how, like in a supermarket, you have kind of aisles with visual information kind of all around you, and it feels a bit kind of enclosed. And then the third principle is predictability. So spaces that were more sensory challenging tended to have a lack of information about the space. So it was very unpredictable. You didn't know kind of what to expect when you were there. The spaces tend to be inconsistent and unfamiliar. And there's just a lot of uncertainty when in that environment. So you kind of had to use additional kind of cognitive resources to navigate an environment that you're maybe already finding kind of very overwhelming due to sensory factors. And then the next principle was understanding. So this was environments that were more sensory challenging could be made more challenging if they had unsupported people in that, and people were experiencing a lot of misunderstanding and judgment. So this might be that staff in certain places maybe don't understand if somebody is feeling kind of overwhelmed, or might experience kind of a meltdown or a shutdown when if the sensory environment becomes kind of too much, and sometimes actually experiencing kind of a lot of stigma around behaviors that people might be exhibiting when they're feeling overwhelmed. And then the fifth principle was adjustments. So challenging places tend to have unsuitable adjustments. There tend to be, so for example, quiet hours is a thing that are in a lot of places now, where people kind of keep the music down, maybe have less customers or people in the building, maybe have the lights dimmed a little bit. But a lot of our participants talked about how they're just really at like unsuitable times. It's like the least viable business hours, but people are like, well, I've got a job, like, or I'm, there should be adjustments all the time that like can help, rather than having 1 hour. One of our participants was like, I deserve more than 1 hour a week to be able to go to the shop. And then they also talked about pace pressures. So a lot of challenging places tended to kind of expect you to go kind of at a certain pace, which can be challenging if you're feeling overwhelmed and can't quite hear people. And also inflexible communication. So maybe when feeling overwhelmed, it is more difficult for autistic people to have a kind of verbal conversation with somebody. And obviously, if that's the only option in your environment, that can be really, really challenging, especially if you can't hear what's going on. And then the last principle was recovery. So spaces that were more challenging, there tends to be no space to escape from the sensory input. So that kind of links in with that, the sensory escape of not being able to escape it. And therefore not having that ability to recover and prepare to re-engage with the environment again. So this kind of, people talked about having quiet rooms, or having easy access to get outside and get back into a place, just to be able to like kind of take a break, reset, and then be able to go. Because otherwise, at the moment, a lot of people were talking about how they just had to actually leave like the environment completely. So people were talking about, I'm in the supermarket and I get overwhelmed, and then I drop my basket and I leave and I do not come back. But they were like, if I had a chance to sit down for a minute, like in a corner, and kind of bring myself together, I could carry on. So so as I said, those are kind of the underpinning factors that we found in that piece of work. But as I teased, I was super interested personally as well, because I am a live music fan. And I like doing fun research, but the fact that a lot of our participants were talking about the sound challenges, the auditory challenges, and so many of the places they find disabling, and yet they were talking about how much they loved going to live music, and it was on the list of the top enabling places. So I figured that it's actually helpful for us to learn a lot more about complex sound environments, which on the kind of, especially because if you think about kind of more stereotypical views that we might have of autistic people not liking sound, but actually people talk about how much they love going to live music. There's a lot we can learn there that we can actually roll out to other environments as well. So so we did this study, which was Autistic Experience of Attending Live Music. This has just been published, which I'm so happy about, and I've got a QR code at the end if you want to read it. I think it's open access at the moment as well, which is cool. But I want to give you, even though I gave you the kind of overall background for kind of sensory stuff, I want to talk a little bit more about what we know to do with like music specifically with autistic people, because I think for me there's like this is where that kind of interesting overlap comes from. So research kind of has suggested that music has a calming, positive mood effect for autistic people. Likely also that is across other people as well. But we tend to be like, oh, autistic people like music. Who knew? But this also overlaps with the fact that music is a common passionate, or some people call them special interest, for autistic people. And that was kind of study that looked at what autistic people described as their special interests, and music came out as one of the top ones of that. So we know that music has a kind of positive experience, but it's also something that autistic people are passionate about. But also engagement with passionate or special interests for autistic people has been shown in research to be beneficial for autistic people's well-being. So you've got this kind of double kind of whammy of why it might be positive, because actually music can be very good for people's well-being, but as special interests and engagement with special interests can be really good for autistic people's well-being, that could actually mean that music kind of is especially powerful for autistic people's mental health. And when we're thinking about the sensory factors of this, we also know from my work that music, but chosen music that people like to listen to, is a common positive sensory experience for autistic adults. So this is kind of them self-describing the sensory input that they enjoy, and music came out as one of the top ones. But also we know that positive sensory experiences for autistic people can be soothing and calming. So that adds another layer in that we're like, positive sensory experiences, special interest, but also just music in general, means that actually this is a really, really interesting area to kind of focus on, because it's got so many different layers of reasons why music should be great. I mean, everyone's like, yes, music is great, obviously. But given that we found that in the study I just talked about, that autistic adults find live music venues to be more enjoyable sensory environments, I thought that was super interesting. But also the fact that previous work by a different team found that 48% of autistic people and their families or carers avoid going to concerts, and find that there are sensory related kind of barriers to it, such as the level of light or noise and the number of people that are there. But there's also additional barriers, such as worries related to judgment from other people. And this study wasn't a focus on music and going to concerts and gigs, it was a more general study. But I think that shows that even in an environment where autistic people clearly like to go because of the sensory environment, there's still actually a lot of barriers to these places. And live music, like actually going to live music, not just listening to it, is an important context to be able to foster belonging and social inclusion. And we also know from existing research that autistic children have said that they see music as an avenue to be able to connect with others and to build and maintain social relationships with others. So like the topic of being able to talk to people about music or listen to music with friends, for example. And the reason why I think this is super important is that 70% of autistic people report to feel socially isolated. So, you know, being able to make live music more inclusive means that, especially if it's a good way for autistic people to connect with other people, means that it might actually be able to help people feel less socially isolated. So this study, we did a qualitative study with focus groups and some one-to-one interviews and emailed written responses to people who would struggle with a focus group. And we had a autistic/neurodivergent research team, and we also included autistic non-researchers in the process to inform kind of study aims, materials and results and stuff. So we had kind of a nice bit of co-creation going on in the study too. And we recruited 16 autistic adults aged 21 to 52, mostly women, as we tend to end up in our online studies. And we kind of had these focus groups with semi-structured interviews, and we had some very broad questions asking people to tell us about their experience of going to live music, and then we really drilled down into finding out a bit more about those kind of positive and negative experiences in that. I won't go into this in too much depth because who cares? But it's we took a critical realist approach. So this really aligns with my perspectives on the fact that we kind of consider like the construction of what reality is versus what reality actually is, and kind of question that, and rather than a kind of positivist standpoint of we're just there trying to uncover the facts in the world. And we use reflexive thematic analysis, which is a really nice approach that aligns with a critical realist perspective, and we took a very iterative approach with kind of having our research questions in mind, but making sure that we were very led by the data and the stories of our participants. Now to the interesting stuff. So we developed 4 themes from the data, and a couple of sub-themes as well. I'm going to go through each one of these at a time, so don't worry about having to absorb all of this right now. But so theme 1 was, this is a military operation, limiting uncertainty and overwhelm through planning. So this is our participants talked about how to be able to attend live music, they would undertake a huge amount of planning in advance, and that was so essential to ensure that they didn't become completely overwhelmed when they were actually at the concert. So they would want to know absolutely everything in advance, from like how to get there, what the entrance rules were, what you could take in with you, what time the show actually started, how you got out of there, like, or like there is no, they were like, you can't have too much information. And yeah, but the fact that how important this was and how it would put them off going to certain venues if they weren't able to get this information in advance. So Kate, these are all pseudonyms, said, I will get so anxious about that, especially as like, because of the security measures and so on, I can't necessarily bring with me like all the stuff that I'd want to bring with me. I saw Muse at Milton Keynes last month, and it was, I think, one of the hottest days of the year, and I was so anxious the whole time, and it was like, this is a military operation, here's how we're going to plan it, which I always think is a great quote, hence why it's in the title of the theme. And then the second theme, our participants talked about basically hating a crowd and loving a crowd at the same time, and this was that social connection thing. So they talked about how there really was this kind of, they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be part of that crowd, because people, would be like, well, if you don't like it, why would you go there? And it's like, it really showed that actually being part of something and connecting with other people, even if you're not there having like conversations directly with people, felt really important to them. But equally, there were a lot of challenges about being in a crowd, because people aren't always very nice. Also, you can still get overwhelmed when you're feeling very stuck in the middle of something where you can't escape it when you need to. And there was still a lot of challenges kind of within that. Also, even like, navigating kind of, through venues to be able to, go to the toilet or get a drink or whatever. Yeah, there was a lot of challenges, but also feeling like you maybe would be judged if you kind of behaved in a certain way that was maybe more autistic or less neurotypical. So Kate again said, yes, you're in a crowd and that can be quite scary, but you're all focused on one thing. There's a sense of togetherness. And Xander said, they're excited for things just as much as I am, but they're going to look at me when I flap my hands. That sucks because I kind of want to be part of the wave and I can't be part of the wave. And we had some other participants talked about other experiences they went to where the musician was neurodivergent and they felt way freer to kind of stim and kind of flap hands and things like that, and how they felt a lot more accepted and not judged there. And then the third theme is the duality of an intense sensory environment, with the sub-themes, the music, the vibrations bring out the colours in my mind, which was related to that immersive sensory joy. And my brain is screaming at me, it's okay until it's not. And this was that really like knife edge kind of experience where it was this loving having that sensory experience. So people talked about it like, I love listening to that band, but when I am there, it's like that, but like just immense. But also saying that actually, though, there were things that could tip that over the edge. It wasn't just about the music, because there's a lot of other sensory input in these venues and events. So Julia describes, when I listen to music at live concerts, it's like all of my senses in my body become more awakened, and the music, the vibrations bring out the colours and scenes in my mind. I feel great. I let go of my stress. I charge my batteries for the next couple of months. So she talked about how that actually had that kind of like, you know, rejuvenating effect, which in juxtaposition to like how autistic people talk about how drained they can feel in other really challenging kind of soundscapes. That's, you know, really important to think about. Actually, it's about what the sound is, not that there's sound. And Claire said, I personally just get so overstimulated as soon as it's above like 20 degrees. So festivals are a bit of a nightmare. And quite a lot of our participants talked about the heat in places and saying like, I want to be here. I'm loving the music so much, but the heat just, yeah, it pushes me over the edge. I have to go home. And then the final theme was, I think the biggest difference always is the staff, combating stigma and creating safe spaces. So this, I mean, it really kind of is what it says on the tin, the fact that a lot of people talked about the fact that if you go to a venue or an event where the staff really get or have had training in kind of autism or neurodiversity and kind of really know what it looks like to see somebody who's in distress and maybe needs a bit of help, or being able to approach a member of staff and say, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed, can I go outside for a minute, or, you know, anything like that. I think that a lot of people talked about really challenging experiences where they felt like they were asking something very simple that would really support them to be able to have a good time, and it wasn't supported. And a lot of people also talked about security staff asking very invasive questions like, what's wrong with you, and stuff like that, when people are trying to explain that they have a disability. But some people did talk about good experiences as well. They just sadly were not as frequent as I would have liked. So Kira talked about people who are maybe having a meltdown and somebody who's not trained, or like the police or security are called or something. And sometimes that makes it, and something that makes it a lot better is really the bare minimum we're asking for, is when you have like a trained member of staff who's just able to recognize that it's that, and that it's not somebody being like deliberately aggressive or trying to cause an issue. And that kind of exemplifies something that's come up in a few of our studies now about how kind of an autistic person having a meltdown often isn't well recognized, and people think it's somebody being violent or aggressive rather than seeing it as distress, even though they're usually being that towards themselves, and have had security and police called on them and stuff. So there's still a lot of widespread kind of misunderstanding as well. So yeah, that's something that we also saw came up in this study. So yeah, so that's a bit of an info dump on all of the findings from that. So just to kind of summarize, this study kind of showed that live music can be a really important and enjoyable experience for autistic people, related to kind of that sensory enjoyment, and also being able to socially connect with other people. And some element of that was also related to kind of having these passionate interests, even though it didn't come up as like a main theme. It was kind of, there was a little thread of that being talked about kind of across the themes. But it also really highlighted that there are still multiple access and inclusion barriers to being able to attend live music. Primarily a lack of information available for autistic people, or just anybody, because I think a lot of people would like more information anyway. And also there being kind of a lack of appropriate adaptations, and also kind of that on like that theme of stigma and lack of understanding as well. And as you can kind of see, some of these things were also kind of really echoed in our earlier work with the 6 principles too. That is the same slide. There we go. I'm just going to shameless plug now. So that that study, we've kind of got a bigger project called Live-End, which is catchy, but the actual what Live-End stands for is live music inclusion at venues and events for neurodivergent people, which is why we call it Live-End. That kind of study is part of this, and we're currently recruiting for a follow-up study. And the aim of this project is to kind of really engage in knowledge sharing with live music venues and event organisers. And other stakeholders, and we've, as part of this, we've worked with the Royal Albert Hall to do kind of a sensory audit and did some resource development with them, and we also did an event there to showcase kind of this project, and we talked about kind of our early findings and stuff as well, and there's some lovely photos from the event, which was so lush. I've put a little QR code because we have a LinkedIn page for it if you want to follow, if it's of interest and you'd like to follow updates, because we're, as I said, we're doing more research now, and we can't wait to share those findings at some point too. And also, this is kind of related, is that we, given the fact that training comes up over and over and over again, so this is just if it's of interest to you or anyone you maybe know, we have an online training platform called New Insight, which all the training on it is free, and it's all informed by our evidence, our research, and also lived experience. And we currently have a course on Introduction to Neurodiversity and Sensory Inclusive Spaces for Autistic People, and also all illustrated by Emily, 21 and Sensory. She's basically my personal designer at this point. And yeah, we're hoping to do a live music venue and events training course soon as well, but we want to collaborate with some venues and stuff, so it's actually really useful. So yeah, there's a QR code on there as well for that if that is of any interest. Oh yeah, you can follow me as well if you'd like to, no pressure. But the last thing I wanted to say, given it's a room of people who are interested in acoustic stuff, there might be music fans, where the follow-up study is finding out how we can make live music more inclusive for everybody, and that is neurodivergent and neurotypical people. So it doesn't matter who you are, please take part in the study if you'd be interested. Yeah, we basically want to make sure that whatever suggestions we're making would actually benefit every single person who attends live music, not just neurodivergent people, because also that's a good sell for venues and events to be like, hey, if you change this thing, everyone's going to have a good time. Because a lot of things we suggest, people go, even neurotypical people are like, hey, I'd like that as well. I would like more information for, you know, how the venue functions or where to find it, things. So yeah, so if you would like to take part, the QR code is there and I would really appreciate it, but no pressure. Yes, so that's me. I'm done talking, and I would love to know your thoughts and if you have any questions or anything. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all again.
Wow. Well, thank you, Keren. That was absolutely brilliant. I think kind of like a virtual round of applause. Brilliant. Right. Well, I'm sure we'll all have lots of questions. So can I suggest that we either post questions in the chat and I'll read them out, or if you want to raise your hand and then we can take a couple of questions now. I might start with a question just while people are typing, if that's all right. Do you find that there's much difference between like different genres of music? Does that make a difference? Is it like a classical concert compared to a pop concert compared to a metal concert? You know, how does it? Is there much variation there?
Yeah, so that's what we're finding out in the new study. Because the focus group one, we did start with a warm-up question to ask people kind of what music they're into and like what kind of venues and stuff they go to, but because it was only like a, you know, kind of a small sample to deep dive into, we realized with like the information we had that it wasn't enough to make any kind of real firm conclusions about it.
Right.
And I've done a bit of research looking at how different like neurodiverse people appraise soothing music, like what music people find to be soothing. So I'm starting to try and like dig down into this a little bit more and see kind of what this maps onto, and different preferences and stuff. But yeah, so in the new study we're hoping to find out a bit more about venue sizes and types of venues, but also genres of music, because it was really interesting because we had because basically people were signed up to whichever focus group time worked for them. And we happened to have a group that were just all into punk. And I was like, oh, how did this, I don't know how it's worked out. It's just the universe brought them together in that focus group. But it was really interesting hearing their experiences of talking about, and there was all punk, and then one person who was into like classical and like sitting in parks and going to like bandstandy things. So it was really interesting having that kind of conversation around people being like, I really like being shoved around in a crowd. That feels good to me. And then someone being like, I go and sit right at the back in a park and like just lie on the floor and listen to music. And like, yeah, so we started seeing these kinds of little narratives kind of coming out and differences. But yes, we're really hoping to delve more into that from this kind of survey study and find out a bit more about the genres, and because obviously the way you engage with music is so different. Like if you're going to a punk gig versus if you're sat in like an opera house, like it's very different. But we just kind of pulled out the commonalities that were across all of these different types of live music events. So yeah, now we're going to see if there's some spaces that are more challenging / less challenging. But yeah, interesting to know.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I have a question from Addie. You can, I'm happy to read it out if you like. She said, really great to hear your positionality statement at the beginning. Thank you for that. I wonder if your research with neurodivergent people has looked at the differences between people with sensory seeking and sensory avoidant profiles.
It hasn't, because we don't see a lot of distinction between sensory seeking and sensory avoidant in terms of it's so complicated. So I have a paper that's called The Complex Sensory Experiences of Autistic Adults. And there is so much modality and contextual factors as to whether, so it's, we can't really distinguish people into being avoidant or being seeking, because it depends on, so some people are like, oh, I'm really avoidant of, like, even in sound we have people who are like, I'm really avoidant and can't cope with and get overwhelmed in environments that are a lot of conversation and, you know, kind of like I was described as the shopping center kind of vibe, but absolutely love kind of live music. So it's really difficult to kind of pinpoint that out, and some people might be really seeking live music and really avoidant of that. So a lot of it is our kind of measures don't really help us unpick that very well at the moment, which I'm also trying
sort of just a bit too kind of crude.
Definitely. So, and we've because as I'm doing qualitative work, we start to kind of peel out a bit of that nuance. But even I think the theme from the music study, that is that kind of knife-edge sensory experience of being like, it's totally fine and I'm loving this, and then suddenly I'm not loving it and I need to run away. So you will literally even have it in exactly the same context, the exact same sensory environment, it'll tip from being absolutely delightful and having the best time ever to I need to run away. So I think we have all these, like, there's like a temporal kind of factor there as well, and also it changes on a day-by-day basis. Some people are like, today I can cope with this environment, next day they're like, I'm tired, I can't cope with this environment, I'm overwhelmed. So yeah, it becomes so complex that we end up being like, I don't know how to deal with this. It's really difficult to categorize people in that sense, but it is interesting the more we're kind of, hence why I love the qual approach, because you can really like play with those nuances.
Well, yeah, thank you. We have another kind of, I think it's kind of a follow-up question. Sylvia said, I think sensory profiles are context dependent, but I'd be interested in hearing Keren's response. So that's kind of, I think, what you've just said.
That's basically what I said. Yes, I agree. So yes.
You're welcome to unmute, guys, and ask your questions yourself if you'd like. You don't have to just listen to my voice. Do you want to ask your own question, Ewan? No. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you're there. Go on, then.
With the mute question. So the solutions that you're looking at and trying out for the venues and stuff, how transferable do you feel they be into other areas of life? Could they be sort of tweaked a little bit and be very sort of work really well within industry and workplaces? So could the core of your research be then taken into other areas and sort of evolved through a HR department to actually support getting people into work? Because as you stated earlier, autistic people are sort of quite a low employment rate.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that was one thing that I felt like was quite, which is, so our first study that kind of developed those 6 principles, it's really nice for us now to start looking at those specific environments to be like, okay, well, are those general principles, do they hold up in this specific environment? And I think the live music one, it was great because we got some stuff that was very context specific, so we can give even more targeted insights. But a lot of the same things came up in that, like the needing more information, needing to be in a space where staff are really understanding, like all of those things kind of do like map on between the 2 studies. So I definitely think that a lot of those are really transferable across a vast amount of different settings. It's helpful to have, I think, the more detailed contextual information, because obviously, like, for example, if we think about the general one, it was saying more challenging spaces have like higher sensory burdens, the inputs unescapable, the input you don't have control over it. But actually doesn't map onto a live music venue so well, because that actually the input, it's quite burdensome, like it's loud. And you can't always easily escape it, and you don't have control over it, but actually because it's an enjoyable sound. So there's these kind of like little caveats where it's like, yes, but so I think, but hence why the actual sensory environment, we tend to say to people, don't worry about adjusting the sensory environment all the time, unless it's something that's like ridiculous, like you don't need that lighting, it's too bright, get rid of it. Like everyone would have a better time. But there's a lot of things where I'm like, if you ignore actually adapting the actual sensory input in that environment, but focus on all the other things, like having training, like trained staff, better understanding, having reasonable adjustments that are actually suitable, providing more information, communicating in a way that works for people, all of those things, if you can make all of that good, then it's actually fine. People won't get so overwhelmed in those environments, because it's all of those things interplaying that make that sensory environment just like, because people are at capacity and then they're overwhelmed. So yeah, so I think so. And we're doing more research as well, looking at the kind of 6 principles in more people and in more settings to check that, basically. But from what we know so far, yes, I think so. Sorry, that was a really long way of saying yes, I think so.
That's great.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I really appreciate the answer.
Okay.
All right. Any more questions before I have time for 1 or 2 more? No. I think we're all absolutely blown away. So yeah, I think we'll say thank you again. Well, I'll give another virtual round of applause. And yeah, thank you so much, Keren, for coming, and thank you for a really interesting talk.
Thank you so much.
Oh, hang on.
Oh, there's a hand.
No, it wasn't a question.
That was a pulse. That was a clap.
It was a pulse.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cheers.
I'll end the recording.